Anybody who's been there will tell you that Oregon is a beautiful state with the Cascade Mountains running from north to south, and they are covered with lush green, thick forest and beautiful lakes and these incredible rivers that rage down past redwood trees and vineyards and finally reach the Pacific coast, which is amazing in itself. But Eastern Oregon is a desert. It is a almost featureless, unforgiving territory. I think it probably looks much like it did when the earth first formed. It is just a hard, brown place. And my guess is that it probably looks a lot like it did when I was there almost 40 years ago. So I was riding my bicycle across the United States. And by the time I got to Oregon, I was riding with a couple of other guys. I had met Abe and Lou. I had met Abe and Lou a couple thousand miles before. And we almost didn't make it as riding partners. They thought I was the kind of the rookie in the group, and they treated me that way, and I resented it a little bit. And I should probably back up and say this. When I left home, my mom gave me a flag to put on my bike. It was one of those, it had like a fiberglass pole that stuck out the back, right? And you stick it in the back. And on the end of the fiberglass pole, there was an orange triangle. And I should say that in the sunlight, it looked more pink. So, but I promised I would use it and that would keep me safe. And, which is kind of ironic considering in those days we didn't even wear helmets. But, so it was in that condition that I met Abe and Lou. And I probably shouldn't have mentioned the fact that my mom made me wear this flag on the back of my bicycle. But strangely enough, within just a few days of traveling with Abe and Lou, the flag disappeared. And I never could get either one of them to admit that they'd done anything about it at any rate. So the three of us forged our way across the country. We fought through snowstorms in the plains and huddled down through a hurricane tornado up in the Bighorn Mountains and fought our way across some beautiful passes in Tetons and dust storms in Idaho, and then here we were crossing over the desert of Oregon. Abe and Lou were quite an interesting pair. They were as different as you can imagine. Lou was this kind of a lanky guy with long stringy hair and this sandy blonde reddish beard, wore thick glasses, and really quiet, thoughtful philosopher. He was curious about the people that he met and curious about the places that we saw. He was just interested in everything around him. He was a quiet and patient person. Abe was something else. He was intense. He was driven and passionate about everything, and all he wanted to do was to go forward, to go somewhere. That was the way he was every single day. Abe was the kind of guy that he spent, no matter what the landscape was like around us, he spent his day with his nose on the white line on that road every day. He was the kind of guy that we would describe other people, not to his face, but other people like this. We would say, yeah, he's like a guy that eats both ends of a green banana and he leaves the sweetest part on the ground. Abe knew where he was every morning, and he knew where he was going to be every night. It could be the next town, or it might be across the state line, over the next pass. That's what he thought about, where he started and where he finished. And that's just the way he was. So here we are, we're entering our first day in Oregon, and we crossed a couple of low passes, and that was about as much as we saw of anything really interesting in Oregon. It was a featureless, bland, just rocky, hard place. You're just trying to imagine this black asphalt strip cutting through this tan world. Everywhere we looked around, just nothing but horizon. There wasn't any street signs, there wasn't any crossroads, there were no villages, there wasn't any bus turnarounds. There's nothing really other than just this road and us. And in the middle of all of this, as we're riding along, there was a mailbox. Now, Abe got to it first. We saw him stop about a mile ahead of us. And we figured he must have had a flat tire, because that's about the only thing that ever would stop Abe. But when we caught up to him, we realized that it was a mailbox. And we're kind of looking around thinking, there'd be the remnants of a house or something, a chimney or foundation or something like that. But there was nothing. And usually we could spot when we were getting close to some civilization. We'd see more, trash along the side of the road, or we would see, maybe some phone lines or a line of trees planted to protect some crops or something like that. We'd know we were getting near somewhere where someone lived, but there was nothing here. Nothing as far as we could see in any direction, except for this mailbox. Abe opened up the mailbox, and inside there was a catalog and some mail. Someone belonged to this stuff. And just as we realized that, off to the north, coming out of the dirt, was an old pickup truck. Came up over our eyes there. Abe shoved the stuff back in the mailbox, and we stood there and waited because we had to see where was this person coming from. So here comes this truck bouncing along this kind of a rutted two-track, just barely visible in the hard-packed dirt there. The truck finally made its way all the way to the road and slammed to a stop. Dust clouds all around it, right? And a man jumped out. Now I want to tell you that Abe and Lou and I, if you'd taken away our bicycles, we would have looked like homeless guys. And we would have been homeless guys. Honestly, we all had long hair and beards, and we slept in the clothes that we were standing in, which were pretty tattered and soiled. And I don't think on that morning in the desert in Oregon that any one of us could have said when was the last time we took a shower. But this guy that jumped out of the truck, he could have been one of us. He came running over to us and wrapped his arms around us and shaking our hands. He was like frantic. He was so excited to see us. He said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe how lucky I am. I just happened to come over the hill and see you guys there." And he was so excited. He almost forgot to get his mail. He was shaking our hands and talking to us. And it was a little creepy at first, but then he realized he was just happy to see us, as simple as that. So he said, "Listen, you got to come back to my house. You got to come back. I'll get you something to eat. I'd love to have you come visit with me for a little while." And then he grabbed his mail and he went around the side of his truck to put his mail away. And Abe looked at Lou and I and he said, "I don't want to go with this guy. It doesn't feel right to me." Now this was not uncommon. This is the kind of thing this is the way that Abe talked. I also knew all three of us realized that if we didn't keep going, that if we spent a whole lot of time with this guy on the side of the road, that we weren't going to get to the next town by the time it got dark. Which is not the end of the world, but that's not the way Abe operated. Abe said to Lou, "Listen, the coast isn't going to come to us." And Lou said, "Abe, the coast isn't going anywhere." This is the kind of conversation that went on all the time, and sometimes it would end up with an argument, and sometimes it would end up with the three of us going our separate directions for sometimes half a day, sometimes for a couple of days, but we always managed to get back together again. We stood there for a while talking while this man was kind of hovering around us, waiting for us to say yes, that we would come with him. And finally, Abe shrugged his shoulders and we took our gear and put it in the back of the pickup truck. And Lou and I climbed into the back of the bed of the truck and Abe got in the front. And as the man was starting up the truck, Abe tapped on the glass to get our attention and then pointed to the rifle that was sitting in the gun rack in the back of the truck. Now, since we've been in the West, we saw guns everywhere. I mean, it was kind of the way it is out there. Sometimes they'd be in the back of pickup trucks. Sometimes they'd be behind these homemade bars where the migrants would drink. Sometimes they'd be in people's hands when they were a farmer telling us not to bother staying on their property. And we didn't like them, but they were kind of a fact of life out there. So we drove about a mile along this two-track, bouncing along in the old pickup truck. Suddenly the guy slammed on the brakes and hopped out, grabbed the gun out of the rack. Lou and I looked at each other for just a minute thinking that maybe Abe had been right. And then we realized he got out and he was taking aim at a buzzard that had landed off in the dirt just off the two-track, killed it with one shot, and then walked over there and dragged it back to the truck and threw it in the bed with Lou and I. Then hopped back in the truck, put the gun back in the rack and kept driving. It was 5 miles from that mailbox back to where this man's house was, bouncing along on this two-track. And by the way, I got to say, the word house I'm using somewhat loosely. It was really more of a shed. It was a conglomeration, a kind of a patchwork of plywood and corrugated metal and siding and old road signs, and you can just imagine. we got out of the truck and he took us inside and showed us the one room that he had there, and there was no water and there's no electricity, and he showed us, this is where I sleep and this is where I eat, He explained that the government had a deal where if you lived on this property for 5 years and built a house on it, they would give you the land for free. He was homesteading. We walked outside and kind of looked around the desert, and we got to thinking maybe the government got the better part of that deal. The man showed us that he had put in a garden right there, and at the end of the garden there was a windmill going around pumping water into a big barrel there, and he had built a wooden greenhouse with plastic sheeting all over it. And he showed us inside. We went inside. He had some beautiful tomato plants, and the rest of the hothouse was filled with marijuana. He said, I can get anything I need. I can shoot all the small game I need out here. I can grow the vegetables I need if I need cash, I just get a garbage bag full of pot and go into the next town and sell it for whatever I need and get by just fine. And then he showed us where he had a little mound of earth next to the house and a door built into it. And he opened it up, and there was a root cellar. Abe wouldn't go down there, but Lou and I climbed down, and it was like 30 degrees cooler inside. And there was shelves carved inside this root cellar, and there was all vegetables in there and some dry goods, and one shelf that was dedicated just to moonshine. He had been making something, jars and jars of it, and as we climbed back out, he grabbed a couple of mason jars, and we went up on the porch and sat down and got to know each other. We cracked open those mason jars and passed them back and forth, and the afternoon kind of spun along, and we got to know each other. And we told him about where we'd been and some of the adventures we'd been on, and the people that we had met, places we had seen. And he talked about how sometimes he'd have these guys come up from L.A. with automatic weapons, and he'd take them out in the wild, and they'd hunt coyotes. He'd get a chance to shoot off their machine guns, and he'd get all the pelts from the animals and the bounties when there was a bounty. And he talked about how sometimes it gets so lonely out there, and how sometimes that it gets so quiet that even the silence has a noise. And the three of us all nodded because we knew what he was talking about. He said, sometimes I talk to myself because I got to do something so I don't go crazy, and I startle myself just at the sound of my own voice. I was watching Abe, for once he seemed relaxed. He might have been the liquor. And I thought for a minute he was dozing off. And he slowly slid over. He had been leaning against the house. He slowly slid over and was laying down on the deck of the porch there. And I thought he was going to sleep, and I watched him slowly curl up. I could hear him groaning, making this kind of a growling noise, and his arms and his legs contracted underneath him. And pretty soon he started shaking. And I nudged Lou, and before we could do anything, suddenly Abe was thrashing on the plywood, his legs and arms kicking like he was some sort of broken toy. His head was banging against the plywood. He was thrashing up and down. The three of us jumped up and stood around him, just trying to figure out what we were supposed to do, and none of us knew what to do. And Abe was going crazy. He was spitting and hitting his head against the plywood. And we tried to grab hold of him, and he was way too strong. He was too powerful for all three of us to hold. And so Lou told us, just get back, just make sure he doesn't hurt himself. And so the man ran inside the house and got a blanket and put it under his head. And we tried to keep him from hitting the house or falling off the porch. And we watched as this guy thrashed and contorted and convulsed on this plywood. His sweat was through his clothes. He was making the plywood wet with his sweat. And blood was coming out of his mouth. He was spraying spit as he thrashed. And this thought crossed my mind while I was standing there. It just dawned on me how fragile we were at that second. We were 5 miles from a mailbox in the middle of nowhere. And I don't know how far to the next town. And I don't know how far from there to a hospital. And the only thing I could think was that as we stood there in that godforsaken desert, was that Abe was never going to see the Pacific coast unless it came to him. Because I was pretty sure he was going to die right there. Now, I was 19 years old. I'd never seen anybody die before. I'd never seen anybody have a fit like this before either. I didn't know what to expect. But for what seemed like forever, Abe thrashed and pounded himself, beat himself silly on the plywood floor of that old porch. And finally, he slowly calmed down and we watched him and tried to keep him from hurting himself. And after a while, he curled up in a ball, like a wadded up piece of paper, and we just listened to him breathe. And after a while, we got him so he could sit up. And Lou got a wet rag and wiped his face, and he had bitten the inside of his mouth, and that's where the blood was coming from. So he wiped his face and gave him a glass of water, and Abe rinsed his mouth out and spit blood all over the place. And it was one of those times like when you go to the hospital to see somebody who's sick, or you go to a funeral, and everything that's in your head doesn't sound like it's the right thing to say. You just can't think of anything that could possibly be appropriate. You can't think of anything, are you okay? Or anything. Nothing made sense to me. And I was kneeling down in the dirt looking at him, waiting for him to open his eyes. And Abe was sitting there, still kind of panting, his eyes closed, and drinking this water, and his eyes slowly opened, and that fire that I was used to seeing in Abe wasn't there right then. And he looked at me and he said, "David." I said, "What, Abe?" He said, "I stole your goddamn bike flag." Thanks, Abe. Appreciate that. We sat there for a little while, and Abe he collected himself, and after a little while he slid towards the edge of the porch and he stood up. And he said, "It's time for us to get on the road." This man, his name was Mark. He said, "No way, you cannot go. Man, what just happened to you? You can't get back on a bike and ride right now. You got to stay, spend the night." He said, you'll feel much better in the morning. You'll be fresh and you'll get a good start. You'll never make it to the next town this afternoon. The sun was already on the other side of the house. And I knew from what the desperation in this guy's voice that he was worried about Abe about this much, but he was worried more about being alone that night again. He wanted us to stay. But Abe wasn't listening. And we refilled our water bottles and got back in the truck. And the man drove us down the little rutted 2-track towards the mailbox. And I could see him in the cab with Abe. And I could see he was talking. He was using his hands. He was animated. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I knew he was trying to change Abe's mind. But I've looked at the back of Abe's neck for 2,000 miles. And I'm telling you, nothing changes his mind once he gets it set. We got all the way to the road and we climbed out, and the man was still talking, still trying to change our minds. And Abe, Lou, and I climbed on our gear. And we shook his hand. It takes a long time to ride away from somebody on a bicycle in the desert when you can see miles and miles at a time. I kept looking back and he was still there. One time I looked back and he was checking the mail in his mailbox again, which is one of the most heartbreaking things I've seen. And I looked back again and he was gone. It was like he was never there. There was no sign of anything. We rode on through the afternoon and the evening, and when it got dark sometime, we lost Abe. Never saw him again that night. He just disappeared in the darkness. I rode with those guys for thousands of miles, and we shared everything. Across campfires, over cups of coffee, over plates of food, sitting in rain shelters, sitting in a tent that was made for one person. We told each other everything we knew, all about each other's dreams, about where we'd been and where we wanted to go. And it just dawned on me, maybe a couple weeks after we split up again, that I never knew their last names, either one of them. I sometimes wondered, I thought about this for a long time, because there's a little bit of Abe in me and there's a little bit of Lou in me. I thought about it when I was on my own. I was trying to make decisions about which way I was going to turn, or where I would stop for the day, or should I stop and meet this person, or do I keep riding? And I remembered, is this Abe talking or is this Lou talking? I sometimes wonder if I just invented them so I didn't go crazy from the loneliness. Thank you.